Okay, so like everyone's heard of the big companies today, right? Apple, Amazon, Google. These companies are huge, right? It's almost like they run the entire global economy.
Yeah, they're definitely powerful, no doubt about that. But it really makes you think, how do they compare to the giants of the past?
And that's actually what we're diving into today. The British East India Company, or like they said back then, the EIC. And honestly, I was going through the stuff you sent, the notes, the research, the historical accounts. It's a lot. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around a company that, like, at its peak controlled 20% of the entire world's GDP.
It's one of those figures that seems almost, I don't know, unbelievable, right? It's hard to even imagine. Okay, so try to imagine a single company today, right now, controlling nearly $20 trillion of the entire global economy. I was like, I don't know, like one company owning Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all the oil companies combined, and then some.
That's just mind-blowing, honestly. I thought Apple hitting a $3 trillion market cap was impressive. So how did the East India Company get so big? I mean, they just traded tea and spices. Right?
Well, that's what everyone thinks, yeah. But that's just scratching the surface. Tea and spices were a part of it, for sure, but they controlled a lot more than just that. Imagine a company today controlling all the production, taxes, even the distribution, like everything. Yeah. Not just like luxury items, but essential stuff. Cotton, silk, you name it. That was the EIC.
So they were like the supply chain masters of their time. Or like the most important stuff in the world. No wonder they were, rolling in it. You mentioned something about their dividends being legendary.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking 20, even 30% returns some years just from owning a piece of this company. Imagine that today. Putting money into a company, any company, and getting those returns year after year. It was unheard of then. It would be remarkable even now.
Unheard of might be an understatement. I mean, investors today would, I don't even know what they would do, probably lose their minds. But you were saying these shares weren't like something just anyone could buy, right?
Right. This wasn't like opening Robinhood on your phone and buying a few shares. This is like super exclusive. I'm talking even the most elite club you can think of would seem like, I don't know, Walmart compared to this.
Yeah.
One share could cost hundreds of pounds back then in the 1700s. And if you adjust for inflation, that's what, tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more today?
You're saying one share cost more than most people made in a year? That's next level gatekeeping.
Exactly. If you wanted a piece of the East India Company, if you wanted to benefit from all that wealth, well, you basically had to already be part of the richest, most powerful people in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't about, sharing the wealth. It was about keeping the wealthy, wealthy.
Okay, so we've got unimaginable wealth. We've got this exclusive club controlling it. This is starting to sound less like a company and more like, I don't know, a small country.
That's not far off, because here's where it gets really interesting. The West India Company, they didn't just have money. They had a way to, let's say, enforce their interests. They had a military.
Wait, a company?
With its own army? You're kidding?
Right. I wish I was. At its biggest, the EIC's army was 260,000 soldiers strong.
260,000? But that's more than most countries had back then, right?
Oh, yeah. Even bigger than Britain's actual army for a while.
Okay. Now that is just wild. A private company, bigger than some countries, with an army to match. So what are they doing with this army? I mean, really? Well, this wasn't about, stopping pirates or protecting their ships. This was about power. This army fought battles, they laid siege, they conquered, they decided how things were going to be in the places they operated. Honestly, the EIC wasn't just a company. It was basically its own government. It had the army. It had laws. It even collected taxes.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around a company having that much power today. It's like something out of, I don't know, a history book or something.
And yet here we are. And that's what's so crazy. Just trying to understand how a single company could have that much influence. People are still debating that today.
So we've got this company, right, controlling, what, a fifth of the entire global economy, giving out these incredibly valuable shares, commanding a massive army. But who are the actual people getting rich off this? I know we wanted to talk about one guy in particular, Robert Clive.
Ah, yes. Robert Clive. Talk about going from, 0 to 100 real quick. Started as a clerk for the East India Company. Pretty humble beginnings. But he was ambitious, I'll give him that. Ruthless, too. He climbed the ranks and a major, major military leader for them.
And that's where you hit the jackpot, right? You were saying his wealth is comparable to some of the richest people today. Yeah, his story is, nuts. From a clerk to an army commander and like super rich. It's hard to believe.
It really shows you like what was possible back then. And let's be honest, there weren't a lot of rules. Remember when we were talking about the Battle of Plassey? 1757, right? That was all Clive. Brilliant, strategically.
Yeah.
But that victory basically handed over control of Bengal to the East India Company.
Oh, right. Bengal. That was like the richest place in the world back then, right? It's like they struck gold. Except it was a whole province.
And not just any gold mine, right? This was the good stuff. Textiles, spices, anything you could grow. Bengal had it. And Clive, he was in the perfect spot. He knew how to take advantage of it. By the time he died, his fortune was estimated at, get this, 300,000 pounds.
Okay, so 300,000 pounds sounds like a lot, but, I mean, that was back then. What's that like today? Give me the modern equivalent, blow my mind.
Okay, get ready.
Right.
Because when you adjust for inflation, you do the whole purchasing power thing, Clive's fortune. It's somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion pounds in today's money.
Whoa! Wait, seriously, one guy, through the East India Company, made what could be $1 billion today. That's insane. And honestly, a little messed up.
It does make you think, right?
Yeah.
What happens when that much wealth, that much power is in one person's hands? And that's why this whole thing with the East India Company still matters. It's not just ancient history. It's about understanding how we got to where we are today.
So let's talk about that impact. Like, what actually happened because of everything the EIC did? I mean, they're controlling this huge chunk of the economy, pushing countries around with their own army. What does that do to the world?
It's like this. Imagine a giant pump, right, sucking up all the resources and wealth from India, from Asia, and sending it straight to Britain.
So, as messed up as it was, what the EIC did was incredibly profitable for Britain.
Exactly. The amount of wealth flowing into Britain from the East India Company was unbelievable. It basically fueled everything. New inventions, investments, even how Britain grew as a country. It's like the East India Company laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. They took Britain from an island to a global superpower.
It's almost like they supercharged Britain's rise to the top. It's fascinating, but also kind of disturbing when you think about it. But we're missing the other side, right?
What about the people who are living where the EIC was operating? What was it like for them?
We can't forget about that. The EIC's profits, they came at a huge human cost. A lot of their practices led to, well, exploitation, people being forced off their land, real economic hardship. And that happened in India and a lot of other places too. Yeah, that's not something you can just ignore. It's a pretty stark reminder that money and power, they often come with consequences. Consequences that can be pretty terrible.
And those consequences. That's what eventually led to the fall of the East India Company. They were powerful, but their actions created a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, and that all boiled over in 1857 with the Sepoy Mutiny.
That was the turning point, right? That's when it became clear the East India Company wasn't invincible.
Exactly. The rebellion, it shook the British government to its core. It showed everyone that the EIC's control wasn't as strong as they thought. And it forced the British government to really look at what was happening in India. And in the end, the rebellion was the beginning of the end for the East India Company.
So what happened? Did Britain just wash their hands of the whole thing after the rebellion?
Not exactly. The rebellion made one thing very clear. The East India Company was too big, too powerful, and honestly, too much of a risk for the British government to handle. They couldn't let this company, this private company, keep acting like it ruled everything, especially not after a rebellion that big. So in 1858, they did something drastic. They dissolved the East India Company, just like that. No more territories, no more army, no more political power.
Wow. So the most powerful corporation in the world was taken over by the very government it had helped make rich. It's a crazy story. They rose to power, controlled everything, and then they were gone.
It's a fascinating story. The East India Company teaches us that no matter how much power you have, even if you're a corporation, it can be very unstable. And it makes you think about how we chase wealth, how exploitation happens, and the legacy of colonialism.
It's a lot to take in, but it's super important stuff. It makes you think. Can we learn from the EIC? I mean, are there companies like them today?
That's the million-dollar question. The world's a different place since the East India Company, but the questions about corporate power, doing the right thing, and exploitation, those are still front and center today.
It's a lot to think about, for sure. We always hear about how much power corporations have today, but the East India Company, that's a whole other level.
It really makes you wonder, what powerful really means when you look back at history. When one company controls that much of the global economy, has a huge army, can basically change the fate of countries. It really makes you think about corporate influence in a different way.
And like, it wasn't just India, right? We've been talking about that a lot, but they weren't just happy controlling one place.
No way. The East India Company, they were everywhere. Trading posts, influence, you name it, China, Southeast Asia, even parts of Africa. They had their hands in everything. They wanted it all. Profit, power, you name it. That's what drove them.
So it wasn't just about the trade routes. It was about, like, setting up entire economies so they would benefit. It's like they were playing this huge game of chess, but with real countries, using resources and political stuff to get what they wanted.
Exactly. And don't forget what they controlled. Tea, spices. That seem pretty basic today, right?
Oh.
But back then, that was big money. Whoever controlled those, they controlled the market. The world market.
It's wild how something like, I don't know, drinking tea today played such a big part in like who had power hundreds of years ago. It really shows you how connected everything is, even back then. Trade and all that.
For sure. It reminds you that people have always wanted wealth. Control over resources. It's a constant throughout history. The East India Company might be gone, but the reasons they got so big, the reasons they fell apart, those are still happening today.
It's a little scary when you think about it. So we've gone through this whole thing, this deep dive into the East India Company. What are like the big takeaways? What should people remember about all this? What's the lesson here from this crazy part of history?
I think the biggest lesson, honestly, is that power, even if it's a company that has it, can be really dangerous if there's no control. The East India Company, they wanted profit so much they ended up hurting a lot of people, exploiting them, creating conflict, causing real suffering. It's a warning. We have to think about doing the right thing, being responsible, and really understanding what happens because of our choices.
Yeah.
All of us, not just companies.
Yeah, that's a good point. The East India Company, it's a good reminder that we can learn a lot from history. It makes us think about who has power, why people chase money, and how the choices we make affect the world. It's a lot to process, but it matters.
It really does. If we understand the past, well, maybe we can do better in the future.
That's our look into the wild world of the British East India Company. It's been a trip through history, talking about money, power, and what happens when one company has way too much of both. We hope this deep dive got you thinking about the stuff that shaped our world. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep exploring.